April the 15th, 1846. A wayside camp of Mormon refugees near Locust Creek, Iowa. William Clayton proudly recorded in his diary the birth of a son and commented,
"In the evening, I retired to my tent to have a social christening. We named him William Adriel Benoni Clayton. I composed a new song, All Is Well."
Little did William Clayton realize that his song would give hope and courage to thousands of Latter-day Saints in his lifetime and would inspire millions of people yet unborn. William Clayton and thousands of other Latter-day Saints had called Nauvoo, Illinois, their home, had built their temple there, dedicating each room as it was completed so they could participate in sacred ordinances. But persecuting mobs would not give them peace to enjoy their temple for long. They looked to the west for a refuge, a new home in the Rocky Mountains. On February the 4th, 1846, the first of the Saints' wagons were ferried across the Mississippi River to Iowa Territory, a slow, tedious task. Then, a miracle? Within 2 weeks, the river froze, and these latter-day children of Israel crossed on a bridge of ice. Sugar Creek, Iowa, 9 miles from Nauvoo, was the first temporary campground of the Saints. At this camp, as at later temporary camps, wagons, tents, and damp blankets were the only protection against temperatures that seldom rose above freezing. The majority of these refugees were parents in their 30s and 40s with young families. They were not old when they started their journey, though illness and grief may have added a few wrinkles and gray hairs before their journey's end. A shortage of food because of the hasty departure from Nauvoo added to their problems. And many families traded their china, their silverware, their feather beds and watches for corn and wheat. Many had left comfortable homes of refinement and beauty, and now they were trading those comforts and refinements for the most basic necessities of survival. Not all refinements were left behind, however. In this first temporary camp, and at later camps across Iowa, Captain William Pitt's brass band entertained the Saints and helped cheer them in the midst of their suffering. The band was invited to play in neighboring towns as well. During one 2-week period when the wet March weather made progress of the wagons impossible, the band gave 3 concerts in a nearby town, receiving in exchange food, produce, and money, $52 altogether. In a camp on the Chariton River, some 100 miles from Nauvoo, the companies of refugees were reorganized to correct some of the confusion resulting from the hurried departure from Nauvoo. Captains over 10 families reported to captains over 50 families, and captains over 50 families reported to captains of 100, who in turn reported to Brigham Young and the Council of the 12. This pyramid organization was maintained throughout the westward trek. The Saints rose to a 5:30 a.m. bugle each day, calling them to morning prayers, breakfast, and an early start. Traveling in single file until they met with Indians when they closed to double file for safety's sake. They took the further precaution of forming their wagons into a circle for their evening encampments. This also served as a corral for the animals. Wet weather forced the Saints to make other temporary camps where they remained for several days at a time. Progress between camps was slow and laborious during that wet April of 1846. At one time, the wagons struggled through mud so deep that only 6 miles were covered in 3 days. Near Locust Creek, William Clayton received news of his wife, Diantha, still in Nauvoo. He wrote,
"This morning, Ellen Kimball came to me and wished me much joy. She said, 'Diantha has a son.' I told her I was afraid it was not so, but she said Brother Pond had received a letter. I went over to Pond's, and he read that she had a fine, fat boy. But she was very sick with ague and mumps. Truly, I feel to rejoice at this intelligence, but feel sorry to hear of her sickness."
That same morning, Clayton composed his song, "All Is Well," no doubt inspired by the birth of his son.
"I feel to thank my Heavenly Father for my boy, and pray that he will spare and preserve his life and that of his mother."
On April the 19th, the advance guard chose a spot where the Saints established their first semi-permanent settlement called Garden Grove. Here they plowed and planted 750 acres. Here they repaired and reinforced their wagons, for they still had a long journey before they would reach another stopping place at the Missouri River. Here future pioneers who were less equipped could stop for a season and acquire the necessary food and goods to continue their journey, safe from persecuting mobs. The migrating Saints established another semi-permanent camp at Mount Pisgah, some 27 miles west of Garden Grove. Here also houses were built and several thousand acres planted and fenced. Mount Pisgah and Garden Grove were way stations where the Saints might stay for a few days or a few months. Some planted crops they would never harvest for the benefit of those who would come later. The warm June weather was a welcome contrast to the wet and cold of winter. But the approach of summer brought its own problems, as Brother Clayton reported at Mount Pisgah.
"The mosquitoes here began to be very troublesome, there being so many of them and so bloodthirsty."
As the summer days wore on, the pioneers continued in their trek to Council Bluffs, Iowa. So named because Indian tribes of the region had held their council meetings on these bluffs, overlooking the Missouri River. Council Bluffs became the site of another way station for the Saints. Crops were planted and a settlement laid out. From here, William Clayton returned for his wife Diantha, who was now on her way to join him. He described their meeting.
"Diantha was very glad to see me and burst into tears. My little boy is far beyond all my expectations. He is very fat and well-formed and has a noble countenance. They're both well, and I feel to thank my Heavenly Father for his mercy to them."
It was planned to send 400 men into the Great Basin that year to plant fall wheat against the arrival of the main body of the Saints the following year. However, this plan was canceled because of the distance, the late season, a scarcity of wagons, and mostly the loss of 500 men to the Mormon Battalion. Its members were recruited from several camps across Iowa. It was difficult for these men to leave their families homeless on a lonely prairie. But their concern decreased when Brigham Young assured them that their families would be cared for and that their army pay would help buy needed supplies for the westward trek. However, their departure created a definite manpower shortage. No men could now be spared for an advance party to the Rocky Mountains. So the Saints made their most permanent way station at Council Bluffs, which later came to be called Canesville, in honor of one of the best friends the Mormons ever had, Colonel Thomas L. Kane. He had spoken up in their behalf and used his influence in the nation's capital to their benefit. During the summer of 1846, he visited the Mormon encampment and described his experience.
"There was something joyous for me in my rambles about this vast body of pilgrims. Wherever I was compelled to tarry, I was certain to find shelter and hospitality. Scant indeed, but never stinted, and always honest and kind."
While in Council Bluffs, Colonel Kane fell gravely ill. He stayed most of the summer with Brigham Young. The colonel sent for a Dr. Eads to treat his illness. But the colonel's purpose was twofold. He also wanted to forestall any charges of murder or neglect against Brigham Young in case his illness was fatal. The doctor would certify to the hospitality given to the colonel by the saints. However, Colonel Kane recovered and returned to the east. Across the Missouri River in Indian Territory, the saints founded the settlement of Winter Quarters in August. In this and less populous communities north of the junction of the Platte and Missouri Rivers, the saints sheltered during the winter of 1846 and 47, preparing for the remainder of their long westward trek. In the late spring, on April the 5th, 1847, the first 4 wagons assembled west of Winter Quarters to await departure. 2 days later, all members of the first company had assembled. President Young called William Clayton from his sickbed in Winter Quarters and assigned him on half an hour's notice to join the group. In the months and years to come, thousands more would gather to Zion, following the path of these first pioneers. They came on horseback, in covered wagons, pulling handcarts, taking William Clayton's inspired musical testimony for their grand marching song. Through all the years since, the song has echoed through all lands, epitomizing the courage and the unconquerable spirit of the Mormon pioneers and their faith in Jesus Christ, in his restored gospel, and in his appointed prophet. They had faith to follow that prophet through hardship, discouragement, and even death.